thank you to Neil for sort of introducing that. I didn't see anyone nodding off, which was really quite useful. But I got a bit of a follow-up to that, which was, obviously Neil asked a question at the beginning, how many of you have carbon footprinted? And I thought I'll ask the other side of that question, how many of you have reduced nitrogen inputs in the last 4 years? We've got a lot more hands reducing nitrogen inputs than we did carbon benchmarking. And I think the key takeaway, or one of the key takeaways from Neil's talk for me, is that if you haven't benchmarked where your carbon is, you're not going to get paid for any of your changes going forward. So whether you believe in selling carbon credits or think it's a complete load of nonsense and you don't want to get involved, and I work with farmers on both sides, it's probably still worth doing it and actually knowing where you sit before you make any more radical changes. So the day has been structured in a way that Neil started off looking at the global brand side, the government, you know, the big picture. We're then following up talking from the supplier, so following on down. So we'll give you sort of the way that we think about things as a supplier, how we view carbon, the things that we do. And then this afternoon, Nick Woodyat's going to talk about the advisor side, how he interacts with this question of carbon on the farms that he works with. And then we end with Tim, who is the farmer, you know, the same as you guys. So we're trying to give you that picture, starting from big picture all the way down to farm scale, so that you can see how that transitions through. So today, firstly, a little bit of background. I think there's a lot of people in the room who have worked with Aiva, but I think there are some that haven't. So it's just a little bit of background to start off with about us. How we work, which is via what we call the systems approach, and it's worth looking at that because carbon itself is one of the key building blocks of that systems approach. Then we're going to talk about some of the carbon products that we work with and why we use these carbon products. Trial results. One of the things that's been said to us over the last sort of few years is, that's wonderful, where's your trials data? So we thought, well, okay, fine. You know, we don't have a huge R&D budget. We can't do 100 trials and give you the 2 that work. So we're going to give you ones that work and ones that don't. Because that's sort of, you know, how we've approached things. Number 5, there'll be a running theme today, cover crops. Neil talked about cover crops. We're going to talk about cover crops. And having seen Tim's talk, and I think part of Nick's last week at Exeter, they're going to talk about cover crops as well. So you'll notice a bit of a theme. And Neil was stealing our thunder earlier with being ahead of the curve. And it's sort of, what are we looking at next? You know, what things are we thinking of? And the salicylic acid question as a potential use as an inhibitor is something that we are going to be looking into. So to start off, just a quick little bit of background. Again, many of you will know this, but Aiva came about in 2015. So came through Mike Harrington, the MD, also the MD of Edifos, the sister company. And it was essentially trying to find products and systems that could be, you know, affordable, readily sourced, consistent, to use in a more regenerative approach to farming, trying to move away from ag chem. So out of that, Aiva was effectively formed as the company to deal with the products, to look at, to source, to refine, to bring through. And part of the remit for my team in the technical team is that we are constantly going out there or getting information in of new products out there, of things that might be useful to you guys. And so that is a remit that all of the technical team have. If we hear about something that kind of piques an interest, bring it to the team, and we then give it to Olivia, who is now our project lead for new products and R&D. So, by the way, if any of you come across something that you think is interesting, send it to Olivia for us, please. Thanks. So it sort of came out from there, and it has been building since. So we took delivery of the Flex plant that does the nutritional products in 2015. That was sort of installed October. First production product called M-Grow, which is a foliar nitrogen with magnesium product in 2016, get the date right. Everything sort of officially moved across in 2017, and in 2018, Mr. Woodyat, who thankfully has left the room because I'm sure he'd have a funny remark about now, joined as the first sort of consultant sales rep. As of 2020, the departments have now grown. I think we've gone from sort of 6 or 7 all the way up into the mid-20s, plus then you've got the Edifos team as the sister company. And in 2022, we opened our second site, which is the warehouse in Leckhamstead. So the original office is at Ginge by Wantage. And then we've got the warehouse, which has built since 2022. Just needs a new concrete driveway getting in, because don't drive there, especially not in anything with really good suspension. And as of the back end of last year, we've gone full circle. So a lot of what we do is actually originally from Nick Woodyat with his background, come from the way that horticulture works and how they view biopesticides and nutrition. And we've gone full circle, and we actually re-entered the horticultural market in the back end of last year. And the team since Nick has grown as well. So 2020, George joined. I joined in 2021, Olivia in 23, along with Joe, and Joe's the one pioneering that horticultural move. And then last year, we had a bit of a splurge. So we brought in Megan, who's in the back corner over there. She is our saving grace for anything that we need at the office. As technical people, we are extremely bad at everything admin related. So she helps us out quite a lot, normally in very, very short deadlines. And then our 2 latest crop health consultants, Laura, who joined us up in the north, up in York, and Danny, who is an Australian guy, very experienced, used to work with him a decade ago in a similar field. He went back to Australia. The wife didn't really like it, so they came back, so we employed him because he was quite good. And they've joined us in the back end of last year, and he's based over Ely sort of area. So he comes across not quite into this area, but the Northampton, Leicestershire. So we're sort of covering a lot more ground, and that's been a really key point to us. Is we're asked quite regularly, you know, we want to try and get you guys to spend more time on farm and be out and about more. And you know, when it was just say me, George and Nick, you know, the entire UK was split into 3. I mean 2 mainly, because Nick went wherever the hell he wanted to go, and George had the east and I had the west, and that was just the way it worked. So we're trying to build that team. But building the team doesn't make us one of the big boys. So this is actually a couple of years out of date. That Syngenta number of 9 billion, I think, is more like 12 or 13 billion now. Aiva there, somewhere at the bottom. Oh no, on the right-hand side, we are 0.005 billion, just to give it some context for the rest. So this is the competition, well, supposedly for us. And as you can see, we are not in the same remit. In fact, I even think Syngenta's new, Valagro, as it was called, which is now Syngenta Biologicals, because that's definitely where they're interested in, is also significantly bigger than us. But this is the background. This is where we have come from and where we're trying to move to. And one of the parts of that I think is quite important is something that's called the Kuhn cycle, which is a sort of a global science-based model, which talks about how science changes. So you've got the bit, you know, pre-science, and then you get stability where everything's quite happy and moving along normally, and you start to see the problems in whatever that model is, which is the drift. Then you get a crisis, then you get new innovation, and everything changes with the paradigm shift. And there's a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture being a paradigm shift into something new. But whilst this applies to science, it applies to everything else. This applies to us as a company. It applies to all of you on the farm. If you've made any changes to the way you do a farming practice, you have followed this model. You've had a thought that something, you know, everything's been going fine, but then there's a few problems. So you've kind of thought, oh, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. There's conflict, there's chaos. So you start to innovate. You start to do things differently, and that creates the change, and then you find a new stable. If the weather played ball, because the last few years, is, you know, we've basically been in conflict chaos for, I think, 3 years now, where, you know, the weather doesn't quite play ball, we would actually get to stability. But this applies to all aspects, and I think it's a good model to keep an eye on, that change and innovation and having is driven by a crisis. It's driven by when things aren't quite going right. So it's not always a bad thing when you're not quite sure whether what you're doing is exactly right, because it's driving that change, and that drive changes us. A lot of the work that we do, a lot of the products that we look at or have introduced have come directly from farmers. Tim with his bloody wood vinegar, for example, or the use of citric acid to get potassium silicate to mix. These are all things that we've been working. Now, I've worked with potassium silicate for over a decade. I had no concept of put citric acid in it, you can now mix it, rather than having it turn into silicon sealant inside your sprayer. But that was fantastic, and all of a sudden now you get to use these products within a more systems-based approach. Just quickly on the products, we sort of have two streams. We have the more nutritional products, the foliars, so we've got the foliar magnesiums, potassiums, the foliar nitrogen range, etc. There's phosphoruses, and that's mainly via what we call the flex technology with the flex plant that we put in. And the way that works as a variation to a lot of products is mostly they're based on salts. They're just sort of floating around within the liquid. Ours are complexed into not a different compound, but a complex that moves through the cell wall quickly as a whole, and then the plant breaks it down. So we don't have the nutrients sat on the leaf drying out. There's a lot of small writing on this. You're not going to be able to read it all. But on the left-hand side, you can see all the nutrients sat on the leaf, greater risk of scorch from, say, like if you sprayed urea onto the leaf, for example, whereas the flex products are very, very good at getting into the crop, which means they're very, very high efficiency. So most of the flex products are 95% plus on efficiency. When you think that, say, soil-applied nitrogen, 50%, maybe a bit wide, soil-applied phosphorus, 20%, 10%. In fact, I've even seen a study that said TSP was 4% not that long ago. And then even potassium, I think there was a study in Leeds a few years ago. Everyone says it's 80%, and the Leeds guys found it was 30. So there's going to be some variation, but the nutritional products are designed with you guys in mind. We want the most efficient products that you can use. And we bring that back to the carbon side. If you're creating products, everything will have a carbon footprint. Therefore, the more efficient it is, the less of it you have to use, and therefore the lower your overall carbon footprint becomes. The other stream of the products is the more, I call it biostimulant, my colleague George calls it the biological range. That's all your carbon products, your silicon products, your out-and-out biologicals, which are these two here. Seaweed, for example, would fall into the same category, but that's a different sort of product stream than the out-and-out nutritional. And most often in our approach, it's a combination of, you know, looking at what the plant needs from an out-and-out nutritional, but also feeding it with carbons and silicons and seaweeds, and we'll get on to some of the reasons for that later on. So that's the background. Really quick background, considering we've been going a decade now. This is the 10th birthday, I think, of Aiva, 2015, 2025. So how do we work as a team? So we follow what we call this systems-based approach. And this is that it's not about the product, he says, with all the product names on the screen behind him. It's about the left-hand side and the actual things that you want to be considering. And the systems approach isn't, we have all the answers. It is, have you considered, when you're going to go and do a pass through a field, what you are trying to achieve with that? And if you have, what are the negatives? How do you mitigate against them? What's the best choices to make? And that's the systems approach. It's not all ag chem is bad. It is, have you thought whether you need the ag chem? From my perspective, working with farms, what I've seen is modern agriculture become more and more chemical. And I've often alluded to it as being the toolbox. And we've gone to a stage where we open up our toolbox and it's a lot of different hammers. And that's fantastic if we've got a lot of different nails. But if I need to undo a nut on my sink, a hammer will work. I can hit it a number of times and get that nut off. What I really needed was a wrench. And unfortunately, our toolbox has just become more and more hammers. And so we're saying, well, having hammers is great, but we need all the other tools there. We need everything else. So you can look at your situation and pick and choose the right tool for the right job. And more often than not, we see a problem, and so we try and kill it. That's the modern agricultural approach. I have X problem, how do I kill it? What do I have to deal with afterwards? So this is based on the systems approach. We've tried to sort of simplify this in a way of 5 areas, the ABCD. And what this is going to is, if you're going to do a pass to a field, have you considered whether you should include carbon, silicon, nutrition, or biological in that application? And if you think about that and the answer is no, I don't need any of those, well done, that was the right answer. But you've thought about it. You've thought, should I have something? Why would I have something? There is an E hidden at the bottom here, which is to do with adjuvants. We've been, for many years, using orange oil, which is a product called Transformer. We're actually moving more into something called Spray Fix, which is a pine oil, which is also a very, very good adjuvant, does a lot of different things, anti-drift and sticker and wetter, about 5 different modes of action. But this is a sort of a blueprint for, I'm going to do nitrogen, should I have anything with it? Well, I think you should always have a carbon with nitrogen. I think I would always like to see some kind of a nutrition with carbon. It was mentioned earlier by Neil. Have you got magnesium, manganese and molybdenum? Should you have them? Have I already applied it separately? Am I growing a crop maybe that doesn't need it? And then would I want to put a biological in there? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But you're going to go out with a fungicide. Let's say it's a selective fungicide. Well, we don't really want necessarily a carbon in there because it might interact, but maybe we want an amino acid. Where are amino acids up here? We haven't put them on there. Oh well, probably under the carbon section. But we know that if a plant gets a selective herbicide, you've all seen it, you've applied it, your crop's gone a bit yellow, it's gone a bit white, it's discoloured a bit. That is your crop taking its own proteins and its own energy, breaking it down into amino acids, rebuilding it all back up into detoxifying proteins, and then getting rid of the bits that you've sprayed on, and then breaking them all back down again and rebuilding them back up into proteins and putting it back where they should be. And so you spray it on, your crop goes a bit yellow, goes a bit sick, and then recovers. And you all think, well, the crop's recovered, that was absolutely fine. I go and look at that as someone who wants to sell you things, and I say, well, you've lost X number of days worth of photosynthesis because your crop's not dark and green anymore, and that crop has taken a lot of energy away from what it should be doing, and it's had to focus them towards something that you did. And so our approach would be, well, can we put something on with that selective herbicide which will mitigate that problem? Can we give the crop amino acids at the same time so it doesn't have to take away from its own reserves? And that's something that we do. So as a systems approach, it's about the sort of the whole thing. And you'll see in a minute, well, obviously we're going to focus on carbon, but I'm just going to, we've taken a slide out here. So there is an overall systems approach one, which shows the trend across the year. We've taken it out in the last week, I think, Olivia. So we need to put that one back in. There are a lot of other factors. We're not just talking about the products themselves and the inputs. You know, we're talking, as I think Neil mentioned earlier, the varieties, the soil health, the tillage or cultivation method. There are lots of other caveats that are all baseline, which should all be considered before we even get to this stage. You know, what are you trying to achieve? But today we're focusing on carbon. This is a really, really, really big topic, or a really boring topic, if you like, Neil. Everything is carbon. This could have been wild. You know, you're sat on carbon, you're made of carbon, you're writing on carbon, and you're wearing carbon. And we're watching carbon. So we've got to try and really narrow it down. And from our part, we're the supplier, we've looked at how we interact with carbon, things that we think about when we're talking about carbon. And in an ideal world as farmers, all of you would be doing these two at the top. That would be the absolute creme de la creme if you had access to lots of manure and lots of high quality compost, and you could be using that regularly in rotation on the farm. And if you're doing that, you probably don't need any of these. There you go. That's a good sales technique, isn't it? Do all the bits that you can do for free, and then you don't have to buy any of this. The problem that we find, generally, is arable farmers probably don't have stock on the farm, unless they're bringing stock in for rotational grazing, etc. So you haven't got access to the manure. Composting is fantastic if you do it right. Do it wrong, and you create some wonderfully bad things. And can you do it on scale to go round the farm? If you're farming a couple of 100 acres, maybe. If you're farming a couple of 1,000 hectares, that's a lot of compost to make. So there is times where time, money, just the actual, the way the farm is set up don't allow you to be doing manures, be doing compost. So what can you do? And what we do is we try and mimic what that's trying to do. And that's where we've got some of our carbon products. Your nurture ends, your fish hydrosylates, for example, are trying to mimic a lot of those beneficial things in your compost and your manures without the biology. Now we can focus in on a few bits, but really today it's going to be humic and fulvic acids. Some of you will have heard us talk about humic and fulvic acids a lot. But they are really starting to come into their own, and actually we are starting to learn a lot more about them and how we should be utilising them. But just sort of a quick breakdown with the humic and fulvic acids, you'll hear people talk about humic substrates or humic elements. That's a combination of both humics and fulvics where they're not really differentiating between them. But they are the building blocks, the humic acids, of the humus. I mean, Neil talks about the soil organic matter and measuring soil organic matter, and that is what humus is. That's what it decomposes into. It's that stable fraction of your soil. And it's worth noting that when we talk about soil carbon and the movement, this is the stable part. This is the bit that doesn't move. It doesn't interact with anything else. It sits there and does nothing. When we talk about that carbon movement, that's the level above that stable fraction, which is the more active carbon. And so even within, when we talk about soil carbons, there are different stages of soil carbon. As Neil said, it gets very, very complex. But we look primarily at our humics and our fulvics, and immediately you can probably say, well, there's a bit of a difference in size, which there is. The humic acids are a much bigger molecule. They're more involved in the soil and soil porosity, but they have a reasonable cation exchange capacity, about sort of 450. Does it say on here? Yeah, 450. Look at that, I remembered. Whereas your fulvic acids are much smaller molecules, much more mobile, and they have an ability to hold cations at around about 1500. So again, can we use humics and fulvics and be more targeted in how we're using them? And we think we do. They will both interact with the soil, they'll both interact with the plant. But with a much larger humic molecule, it's better that that is more involved in soil and soil work, whereas once you go into foliar applications or anything going through the leaf, that's where the fulvic acid really comes into its own. So we're trying to move on from the very basic, well, here's humic and fulvic, you introduce it and it does some things, and actually look at how can we be more targeted in where and how we're using these. So the humic acid's really interesting in that it does a lot of good work in the soil, buffering pH, buffering toxicities, as well as holding on to more nutrients. It's also a fantastic fungal food source as well, and is really, really strong at water holding capacity. We're seeing a lot more weather events, shall we call them. I live in Herefordshire. I live in the Wye Valley. We have a lot of weather events at the moment. Luckily, I live on top of a hill, so I get to see all the floods and the water go by me. But I also see all the brown soil. I think Nick will show you a nice photo of that later. He doesn't live in Herefordshire, but he gets our soil. So, but we could do with holding a lot more of that in where we are, and that's where your building of humic acids really comes in. The fulvic acids, though, as I mentioned earlier, are far better at actually moving that nutrition into crops. And that's where, going back to that ABCD with the carbon, if we're going to apply a foliar, we want to apply a product with that as a carbon product, which is a higher fulvic component than a humic component. So again, targeting down into, rather than just broad idea of carbon, what carbon? And we've seen now, I think over the last few years, that because carbons aren't all the same, diversity becomes quite interesting. I've had some real success over the last few years of using fish hydrosylate in a 50-50 with Nurture N or Citadel, which is the more amino acid products. And that seems to have worked better than those products individually in places, certainly along with a compost-based nitrogen system or compost-based system, which has been really interesting to me because that diversity of the different types of carbon seems to be having quite a significant effect on plant-soil interaction and plant growth and plant health. So we'll often use the fulvic acids as a chelator for foliars. We've introduced this as the next sort of stage. Most of you here in the UK, unless you're doing something really, really clever and efficient, will have quite bacterially dominated soils. And actually what we often want, and I believe Tim comes to this later, is more fungally dominated soil, or at least more of a one-to-one. And so when we talk about the types of carbon we should be utilising, this is where, down here at the bottom, your ulmic, your fulvic and your humic acids are the better fungal feeders. If I wanted to feed the soil bacteria, I'd probably just use straight molasses, straight cane molasses. And there are carbon products out there, we'll get to them I think in a slide or two, which are really, really good at feeding this. And they're the more simple carbon products. We're now trying to move forward with the more complex carbon products and actually look at how we can get more of the fulvics in. But ideally, this bottom section are the two that we should be sort of focusing on for soil. And that's where some of our products like the Nurture Ns, for example, and the Citadels are sort of key. But if you're only applying the simple sugars and the simple carbon products, you're really, really good at feeding the bottom end of the food chain. Bacteria, nematodes, maybe the protozoas. Once you want that complex system to start working, if you apply, say, a cane molasses, it doesn't really feed the rest that well. Yes, you'll get this big bang of these, but it's not feeding themselves. So you're reliant on the food chain running through. So once you want to get to, say, the third trophic level, you're feeding a system with a simple sugar cane molasses that's feeding the very, very start. And that's great to a point. You will get an explosion and the rest of it will feed off it. But a much more stable approach is trying to feed the whole food chain. So the later stages, your larger soil-borne biologicals, your fungus, etc. So, as a product, sales rep, just a reminder, we use Nurture N, and we use Nurture N quite a lot as one of our major carbon-based products. You've just seen me talk about the humic and fulvic. That is the biggest part of the Nurture N, along with some amino acids. And our primary use for Nurture N for soil is in with nitrogen, liquid nitrogen, or in with glyphosate quite often to increase the efficiency of uptake and the chelation and reducing the losses of both. Both have been very successful. I'm hopeful there's probably people in the room that have been using these. And that is about a 40% humic extract. You'll note I don't say humic and fulvic. but it's around about 40% actually fulvic and a few percent humic. So ideal for acting as a chelator. But we'll still put it in with some of the foliar nutrition. You could still use it as a chelator for some of the pesticides that are being used. It will still help to move it across the leaf membrane. But also with the Nurture N, and this has sort of come about a bit more recently, is there's an awful lot of trace elements in it. I get a lot of questions at the moment where we're moving into, say, a more foliar-based system, and a lot of people ask me about potassium. And I'll come to potassium properly later when we look at some of the cover crops. But if we're trying to move people away from, say, some of the more harmful soil applications like your muriate of potash, which has a very high salt index, which is pretty detrimental to soil biology, what can you change it into? And so we're doing a little bit of soil-based potassium, not a lot, bit of polysulfates and a few other bits, maybe a bit of fibrofos, but very, very small amounts. So if we're then doing a lot of potassium work foliarly, where is it all coming from? Where is all our potassium coming from? And so we sat there with my farm and we worked out how much foliar potassium we needed, and then suddenly realised we hadn't accounted for the 5% worth of potassium coming through Nurture N. And so all of a sudden we went from, sort of 30, 40 kilos of foliar potassium up to about 60 odd kilos of foliar potassium. Job done, we're quite happy. We grew some decent crops off primarily foliars last year. But there's a really interesting balance of nutrients coming through the Nurture N that we don't really account for when we're looking at our foliar approach. So it's just worth bearing that in mind if any of you are already using the Nurture N. I mentioned some of the simpler molasses products. Anybody here use Boost? I've got a lot of people that have used Boost. It's a simple cane molasses with a bit of sulfate of ammonia and yeast put in. When we go back to that trophic level, it's very, very good at feeding soil bacteria. It's not a fungal feeder. If you're trying to move your soils into a more fungally dominated system, Boost probably isn't the product. It's not saying it's a bad product. It's a really good product at doing what it does. It's just the question of why you are using it and when you're using it. But there are some more complex products out there. The Black Label, the Carbon N Balancer from Hutchinson's, the Black Label from ED and F and Man. You'll notice both of them are basically identical, and they are co-products from the sugar industry, as similar as our fermented molasses products are. So they're on a similar level, but they aren't as complex as the Nurture N, because that takes an added fulvics, humics, etc., and adds it to the molasses. We're using that fermented molasses as a base and then building off that. So talking of complexity, we can see that we run from when you could apply straight cane molasses on a soil, but the next step up would be something like Boost, step up again in complexity, these, and then we end up at the top end, or what we think is the top end. We haven't found a carbon product that's more complex yet. If we do, we'll probably have a look at it. So overall, when we're talking about carbon, you can see that it's getting more and more complex, but primarily we're focusing on the Nurture N as the main carbon product that we use. But you saw citric acid up there, you saw fish hydrosylate up there. There's no problem with using these. They are an integral part of a lot of our systems, and we have them as part of the portfolio. They're not our products, but we have them available so that people can come to us as the hub and say, have you got access to this? Yes. Can we get it? Yes. And it's a nice, easy source of supply. Trials. You've asked us quite a lot about trials, maybe not you guys directly, but it's something I hear a lot when I do little talks, or certainly mainly from industry and advisors. Where is your trials data? So we thought we best actually do a little bit more trials work. And I want to say last year, but it's actually 2 years ago now, 2023, and some of you will have already seen this. We did our first sort of real proper deep dive look into Nurture N as a soil amend, as a nitrogen additive going in with liquid nitrogen. And this trial was run by Oxford Agricultural Trials, OAT. and we did a very simple one, which was we took a control of 236 kg of N using an N32, and we removed whatever the kilo amount is, 50, 60 kilos, but it was a 30% reduction, and we added a 2.5% inclusion of nurture N. So there's a significant nitrogen reduction overall, but we've added nurture N. And the yields, we out-yielded by 0.3 of a tonne. So 0.3 of a tonne, it's decent. I mean, it would be fantastic if it was more, but it more than pays for the difference in the nitrogen. So we're not spending more. We've added more yield. And if you'd have done your carbon footprint and you were getting involved with all the things Neil was talking about, you're probably going to get paid for reducing that nitrogen as well, on top of that. So you can start to really stack these effects up. But that was 2 years ago. And in fact, before I go on to last year's trials, I'm just going to jump into another piece of trial work we did this year. We were asked this question a lot last year following the introduction of the inhibitor guidelines, which was a lot of farmers using nurture N. If we're using your nurture N, because it's acting as a chelator, it's binding into the nitrogen, do we need to use a urease inhibitor after the 1st of April? Will the nurture N do the job? There we go. Answer? When we get there? No. So we partnered up with the Royal Agricultural University and we trialled exactly that question. We took that question on board and said, we best answer this. So this is, we were actually asked and told in the first talk, in fact in the second talk, you should take this out of your talk. Nobody reports trials that don't go right. And I looked at this and went, this trial did go right. We were asked a question, we trialled it, we got an answer. The fact that the answer didn't help us sell more nurture N is not a failure. It is giving us an answer that our clients were asking us for. And it also threw up some really, really interesting extra little bits as well. This was the trial, partnering with RAU last year, doing some controlled trials, and they were looking, I think, at methane and ammonia. Yeah, so as part of their in-house laboratory and measuring it every few days. So you've got the days here, 0, 5, 12, 23. And you see ammonia with nurture N on day 5 goes through the roof. And you think, wow, this is a terrible inhibitor for urea. And then you stop and think, but why would it have done that? And the simple answer is, we fed all the soil biology. So what nurture N did is it promoted all that soil biology on day 5 to go, oh, we're away and we're off. So while it's a terrible inhibitor, it's a fantastic soil biological feeder. And we proved that. Day 5, day 7, everything was jumping out. What also became interesting, it wasn't significant to sort of look at, but there's a reduction in ammonia thereafter. So although we're feeding that soil biology immediately and getting that reaction, we're then actually slowing down the losses to ammonia later on. Now, an inhibitor, I think, needs to be sort of 60, 70% ammonia reduction to sort of get within the right framework. So, no, it doesn't sit in there. But it proved to us it was a very, very good soil feeder. And then it brought about the fact of, what else can we look at as an inhibitor? Because me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of inhibitors, not because they don't work, I think they do, but because the vast majority of them are solvent-based inhibitors. So there's an issue of, what are they doing in the soil? And I'm a big fan of Jurassic Park, and I always go back to the quote, nature will find a way. And it wouldn't surprise me if in the not too distant future, these inhibitors just stopped working, because nature will find a way around it. It created the urease enzyme many, many, many years ago, and I don't think we're clever enough to deal with it in the few years that we have. So the following up questions then, having seen that as a result, should we still be using nurture N? Well, yes, it's a fantastic soil feeder. It will partner really well with your nitrogen to increase the efficiency of that nitrogen. the next trial we'll look at after this will sort of reinforce that. And some of the inhibitors that are out there are not great for the fungi in the soil. So again, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, if our system is to try and boost the fungal capacity of our soil and move from a bacterial to a fungal dominated soil, we don't want to be doing things which are then diminishing that fungal activity. But at the moment, if you want to use urea after the 1st of April, then realistically you'll have to put an inhibitor with it. So following that, Olivia and Mike have been working together to look at what is going to be the best inhibitor from our perspective based on the approach we're looking to do to suggest people use. And I think that work's still ongoing, or have you finally decided on one?
Whittling it down.
You're whittling it down. So is it looking at a water-based inhibitor, is that right? Yeah. So we're actively now looking at to recommend to you, if you're going to have to use an inhibitor, which should be the inhibitor you should choose from. And then the question of, the next one we had was, if I have to use an inhibitor, could we still put Nurturen in with it? Honest answer, we don't know. I don't think Nurturen should have an effect on the performance of the inhibitor. The inhibitor's already there, and we've seen what Nurturen did afterwards. And you know, they shouldn't interact. I don't think Nurturen will stop the inhibitor from working, but the honest answer is we didn't trial that because we didn't yet know that Nurturen would or wouldn't be a good inhibitor replacement. So there are more questions, and as any good trial does, it throws up a lot more questions than answers, but it's taken us another step further. It's taken our knowledge and our understanding further so we can now look to the next step, and inhibitor alternatives is something I'll come to later. Last year's trial with Nurturen, we thought obviously the 23 results were good, but we needed to do a little bit more. So we partnered up with Velcor on their trials. This was a much bigger trial, actually looking at a lot of biologicals. There was R-leaf, there was Vixaran, there was Blue N. They haven't given us any of their data, unfortunately, so we don't know how well or not they worked. But we did a very simple one, which was they had their nitrogen curve, 75, 150, 225 and 300 kilos of N on their standard nitrogen, and then they had a whole load of various different things at different rates. We joined in and said, okay, if you're going to apply 75 kg of N here, can we do 75 kg of N as a UAN plus 12 litres of Nurturen? And they did that on 2 sites but 3 plots, Font Hill and Stoll Park were the 2 sites. The CC refers to cover crop. So you've got here at Stoll Park with a cranium, it was after a cover crop and not after a cover crop. And you can see at 75 kg of N, Nurturen has done a very, very good job at increasing the yield. Low N system. But at all the other sites, it also did a good job at increasing the yield. The interesting takeaway from my perspective, because I already knew Nurturen worked to improve nitrogen efficiency, was the control where they had a cover crop and the control where they didn't. And it turns out having the cover crop reduced yield. You've heard Neil say how good cover crops are. You'll hear me later on say how good cover crops are. You'll hear Tim say how good cover crops are, and yet here it reduces yield. And at the extra talk, we were asked, do we know what type of cover crop it was? And my glib response was, not a good one. Because cover crops, if you don't grow them well, will take nutrition out of the system and it won't give it back in. So it's taking away from the system. And later on, we'll look at what cover crops can do and why they do need to be well fed. Interestingly, there was a follow-on. We also put the same one in at 150 kg of N in the Velcor trial at the 3 different sites here. But we asked them to, they didn't, increase the amount of Nurturen. So we had the same 12 litres of Nurturen in both the 75 and the 150. Do we get a yield increase? Yes. Is it statistically significant? No. But there probably isn't enough Nurturen for the fact we've doubled the amount of nitrogen. We haven't kept our carbon-nitrogen ratio in the same balance. So the chances are, were that 20 to 25 litres of nurture N, we may have seen a similar result to this previous slide. We may have seen that big uplift. We also, because we got a lot of results, and the one bit that I noticed I thought was a bit strange, so I thought we'll report it because it looks a bit strange, was protein. So they did the protein for all 3 sites. And at 75 kg of N, not only did the yield go up, but the protein went up. And I thought this seemed really, really odd, because in a low nitrogen system, you'd expect yield or protein. The plant will kind of do one or the other. If it pushes it all into yield early on, there won't be enough N left for protein. And yet we got, bizarrely enough, an increase in both. So the efficiency of the nitrogen, that 75 kg, has been made so efficient, it's actually pushed these crops on. Anyone here growing wild farmed? Don't put your hands up. I don't want you to out yourselves. Well, were any of you growing wild farmed last year? Yes, there's a few. Okay. I'm not going to ask you if you've carried on. There's been a few that we've had some phone calls. But looking at that, it made me really think, in a low nitrogen system like a wild farm system, nurture N, the carbon, actually becomes a lot more important than probably the nitrogen is. Obviously, the original nitrogen curve, I think, topped out, the highest yield was at 225. At 300, it actually dipped a bit. So Velcor came back and said, next year, nitrogen should be 225. I'm just going to flick between these a little bit here. Yield at Fonthill at 75 kg of N, 10.5. Yield at 150 kg, 9.58. We out-yielded double the amount of nitrogen by adding nurture N. I'll just show you that again. 10.5 tonne here, 9.58 in the control. We actually got a slight reduction here, but again, not enough nurture N. So we're sort of just proving that efficiency of the nitrogen that we're using, everything else was the same, that it is possible to get a real yield uplift. And we saw from that OAT trial, I think it was 1/3 of a tonne. We've got roughly 1/3 of a tonne on a lot of these, sometimes even more. And I just thought we'd drop it all in together just to sort of keep a view on that. So you've got your controls on the left, and then your the Aiva approach. So overall, we've seen a really good response to that. And ideally, we'd like to carry it on next year, but maybe get the right amount of nurture N applied and try it at the 225 as well, and see whether really pushing a system, how effective that balancing of carbon can be. Anyone here grow potatoes? Didn't think so. Okay. We are partnered with Deb Agronomy, who are sort of a very similar company to us, but on the potatoes, but also a lot of the root vegetables. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this if you're no potato growers, but there is one sort of key aspect I do want to focus into. Last year, well, year one, so this was 2023, we were looking at using the Aiva approach to see whether we could affect yield and tuber sizes. This would be a sort of a standard approach. We removed that last 50 kilos. We put in the Aiva approach, which was the nutrition mainly. And we increased yield by over a tonne. But the important bit, because this is where they get the premiums, is we increased the baking section by 50% increase in the baking section. So by just removing that straight nitrogen and replacing it with a more nutritional based package, we can get increases. The reason why for me, because I don't do a lot of potatoes, this is interesting, is if we can do it in potatoes, which are inherently difficult crop to grow, then we should be able to follow this through into the cereals. And actually the year 2 results really gave me an indicator that that's possible. Looking at blight. This trial came about because mancozeb has now gone as the chemical approach, and that was the potato growers' earliest blight spray that they could use. So what could they do in the early stages? So you've got blight coming in 15 days post the previous, 29 and 36. It was a low disease pressure year for blight last year. Let's put that on the table straight away. So early on at 15 days, very little difference across the board. By day 30, 29, we're getting a good bit of blight coming into the uncontrolled section. The full chemical approach is actually doing reasonably well. The 50-50 approach, which was half chem, half Aiva, is doing terribly, which was interesting. But the full Aiva, no chem approach is doing the best. That was quite interesting. We liked that. That looked good. And then we got the day 36. And at day 36, when you realise that your 3 fungicide applications is working just as well as doing nothing, you start to sort of think, what's going on here? The 50-50 has actually done really well, but again, the full Aiva approach has outperformed them all. You're not going to drop fungicides from growing potatoes. I don't think you even can drop your fungicides from growing potatoes. It has to be included. But the key takeaway is in potatoes, we have controlled disease using nutrition. And that's the key when we bring that through into the cereal side of it, into the oilseed rape side of it, is we were using Armour, Pulsar, Rampart, BioPlus T and Consortium in year 2. If there's anyone here working with Aiva and going down the reducing fungicide approach, you're going to recognise all those names because they're the sorts of things we've been suggesting you apply if you're trying to reduce your fungicides. Because the same approach, you know, your blight is a fungi, it's still acting on the leaf in the same way as your septoria or your rust is. It's still trying to get a foothold on the leaf and penetrate in. And the Aiva approach is to try and stop and prevent that initial infection for as long as possible. And we're seeing that this worked. That the first year's approach was phosphorus, foliar nitrogen, trace elements, more phosphorus, more magnesium and some seaweed. So again, it is about trying to utilise nutrition to make plants and the system more resilient to disease, a hardier, healthier plant. Where am I at time-wise? I think I'm almost there, so I best zoom. I talk a bit slower than George and Olivia, so they only did about 50 minutes. Cover crops. Is that a cover crop? Some of you will have had cover crops like that. And the answer is no. That's not soil armour. That's not nutrient cycling. That's a weed at this point. And a lot of us will have had cover crops that look like that. We have not gotten into the field until late. We've spent our £60 a hectare worth of seed and we're damn well going to use it this year because, you know, that's what we need to do. And we end up with a cover crop that looks like this. This is what I expect that Velcor cover crop looked like. It is not helping the system to build. It's not building carbon. It's not building nutrient availability or cycling. The roots in this crop probably aren't really exudating carbon and interacting much. So the type of cover crop that we end up growing needs to be something like this. It needs to be big biomass. I'm not really that bothered about the different varieties in it. Neil's covered that. Tim's going to maybe look at what he does. But the varieties in it, I'm not really that bothered about. I've seen just as good a results with a field full of mustard as I have an 11-way mix. The big difference for me is one costs £15 a hectare and the other one costs £75, £80 a hectare. But the results to the following crop were very, very similar. And it's about building that biomass to get the return. And so you have to look at that from the systems approach again. How am I going to get the big biomass cover crop? Ideal world, you drill it early or you get it in early, you get it away, and you don't need to go near it again. You drill it and you walk away. That would be in an ideal world. But we've all had it where the cover crops maybe gone in a bit late or not gone in the best of conditions and it's struggling. Neil mentioned it earlier about treating the cover crop like a crop, and I would completely echo that. We do, and we have, put nutrition onto cover crops. Absolutely. If I've spent £60 a hectare on seed and I need a big biomass, I've got to get that big biomass for it to be effective. We've just seen what a poor cover crop can do, it can have a negative effect on yield. And so you start looking, and writing might be a bit small, but your traditional crops are here on the left-hand side, and these are your cover crops. And the cover crops are basically giving you everything that is good. Obviously, there are some, benefits of a traditional crop, like making you money, hilariously, or just being part of a crop rotation. But the cover crop is actually bringing you far more benefits to your soil than your main crop is. So really, if it's struggling, if you're drilling it late, if you're drilling it into poor conditions and it's not doing very well, you should consider, again, whether any of these inputs might help it along. Maybe it's just a seed drench when you put it in. You know it's going in a few weeks late. I mean, I think it's something like double the biomass from potential 2 weeks at the end of summer. 10 days earlier doubles your biomass. So if you're 10 days late, then should you or would you consider spending a bit of money on it? Maybe a seed drench, maybe a bit of seaweed and amino acids. You don't have to go, I need to pick 3 things out of every single section and spend £100 a hectare on it. But maybe it's worth spending you £10 a hectare, £15 a hectare to get that cover crop to do what you drilled it for. Why is it important? Big biomass cover crops. This is a good cover crop from quite a good fertile soil. Mike, this is one of yours. Fertile site? He's in the audience. Oh, good, excellent. This is going to be wonderful then. So, 350 kg of N in that biomass, in that cover crop at the top. We've got 260 kg of potassium. Now, if we're going to start trying to recycle all of this back into our soil and back into the system, we have got a fantastic head start here into the next crop. Yes, there'll be some availability issues potentially, and the destruction method will affect whether we're carbon building or nutrient cycling. But this brings us a green area index 4.5, massive tonnage off here. I think we've got a dry mass index of 7.5 tonne. That is a fantastic cover crop, and it's going to be doing a great job at cycling the nutrition. Now, this is not a bad cover crop. This is a cover crop off a lower fertility soil, I think near Northampton. So this was also quite a reasonable cover crop. We can see we've still got 5.5 tonnes worth of dry matter, but we've got half the amount of nitrogen, and we've got almost half the amount of, 2/3 of the potassium. But we're still cycling a lot of this back in. And so you start to see, obviously these 3 at the bottom weren't tested, you start to see where a lot of those nutrients that cover crop is mopping up from the previous crops is coming from. I mean, go back to the previous one. 352 kg of N. That's massive. There we go, at rough prices. I'm actually just going to cycle through quickly because this is wheat. And obviously this is someone in the audience as well, I think, so ignore the name. But this wheat crop in June is currently holding 400 kilos of N. That's biggest biomass of that wheat crop is holding 400 kg of N and 295 kg of potassium, just picking out the big numbers. But if I go back, we're actually not far off with what our cover crop was holding. If we can try and cycle as much of this back into the soil as possible and get it working, it's not all going to be available to that next wheat crop. Your phosphorus probably 20%, but your nitrogen and potassium, you get a fair chunk of if you do it well. So we start to see that a crop that we don't have to spend a lot of money on growing is bringing an awful lot of nutrition. And I think we priced it out. That first cover crop, the 7.5 tonne dry matter, priced out at about £700 a hectare once you priced out all those nutrients. And even the low fertility one was over £500 a hectare. And you are paid to grow these under these new SFI guidelines. That sounds like a winner to me. I best hurry up because I'm way behind. The availabilities, Here, as you can see, your nitrogen, you should be getting, potentially up to 80% from a legume one, much lower with phosphorus, but decent for potassium, and even the micronutrients come into the equation. Part of the reason why I thought this one was interesting for me is 160 kg of nitrogen was applied to that crop, yet that crop has 400 kg of nitrogen in it. Where does the other 140, 240 come from? It comes from the soil. More importantly, the potassium, there's 300 kg of potassium in that. It's still low, according to our foliar result. Did the farm apply 300 kg of potassium, Mike? No, not at all. I was asked this question by a farm down south the other day. He was considering putting MOP on for his 60 kg of potassium. So I showed him this. And I said, so you're prioritising 600 kg of potassium with a product that will stop soil biology from working and will stop the other 240 kg of potassium from cycling from your soil. And he went, no, you're right, we're going to change that. So that theory, that thinking about the sort of input you're going to apply and where you're prioritising spending the limited amount of money that you've got on inputs certainly means that we do need to be looking at things like where the potassium's coming from, the product that we're using, and whether the cover crop can effectively act as an input type. We need to consider how we, this is the measurement of it, so we just take a quarter metre quadrant, take all the biomass out of that quarter metre quadrant, bag it all up, weigh it, so you know how much was in that quarter metre, you send it off to be sampled, and from that you can figure out then, from that onto the analysis, how many kg per hectare of the nutrition that you've got, and that's where these, how these reports are produced. And you can go out and do this yourself. The only piece of equipment you need is that. That's it. That's your equipment. Oh, and a set of scales, I suppose, as well, because you need to weigh it before it gets sent off. You don't need us to come and do that. You can do that yourself, and you can start analysing what your cover crops are cycling, what nutrition is coming back. And this is where the crop destruction comes in. This could be a whole talk on its own, I reckon, quite easily, or at least an hour's talk. But for me, the gist is, if you want that nutrition to be cycling back in, destruction is green. You're destroying that crop green, or you're grazing it, or you're flailing it, or whatever. If you want to build carbon, the destruction is brown. You want brown material to be cycled back into the soil. So again, when you're growing your cover crops, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve nutrient cycling or carbon building? Because that's going to define how you treat that cover crop and how you terminate that cover crop. But again, as I say, that could take a while. Going to zoom through these because I am about 5 minutes over already. We've talked about Nurture N being used to go in with, say, liquid nitrogen. We get asked, are there solid products that we can use? This year we're introducing a humic granule. This can be applied and spread straight onto the soil, either alongside or with your nitrogen, or you could put it down with your seed. So it's a solid option. Not everyone has sprayers. But this has done a lot of work done on it in Spain. As you can see, this is I haven't got the name on there. We're working with a company called Damesa, it is, who have done a lot of the background trials work on this. So that's one for this coming year. Chitosan is a new one. Some of you will have heard chitosan mentioned. Chitosan, I mean, basically it does everything, but no bugger can make it actually do it consistently or mix it properly. But it is sort of a byproduct from the exoskeleton of crustaceans, and it's sort of part of what that the exoskeleton is made of. And it acts similar to an elicitor for plant defense. Maybe you've used some of these products like the iodus, which is your laminarins, your brown algae seaweeds. They're not doing anything particular in terms of direct, but they're acting as elicitors to the plant's system. We do the same thing with salicylic acid as well. So we're going to start looking and researching and doing a lot more work as to when and how we can incorporate chitosan Again, that's another Olivia job because we don't like her. And it's going to be a nightmare to try and get that one to work. But, you know, I think in amenity, they're doing a lot more with it. And I think we need to sort of take on some of these little extra aspects from other parts. As I said, Neil stole our thunder. Olivia did a lot of research into the inhibitor work, and that ROU inhibitor trial was her baby. And when it came up as it isn't an inhibitor, she immediately went off and started looking at what could be, and came across the fact that there's research which basically shows that where we talk about how these inhibitors work, they actually bind into the site where things like zinc or nickel would go as the cofactors, and they prevent the urease enzyme from interacting. Turns out that salicylic acid is a similar enough shape that it might also be able to sit in that hole and prevent the urease enzyme from interacting with the nitrogen. So we're going to start having a look at whether applying salicylic acid with liquid N in particular would replace an inhibitor. Because, you know, we asked the question because we've got farmers who don't want to use inhibitors. So can we find something that will work? Possibly. And as Neil alluded to, we found some of the research, but not all of it. There is an article which is called An Overview of Metal-Based Inhibitors of Urease, if any of you really want to go and have a look at it yourself. And you can see here from the image that they would fit. I can't remember which one it is. Olivia put this one together. I've zoomed through the end of it, but thank you very much for listening. And we're going to break for lunch. Obviously, as I said, we're going to go through into the next room. I don't know if that's after lunch, do we know? Or are we having lunch in here? Nobody? Okay, well, we'll break now. Go and grab yourself a cup of tea and coffee, and we'll find out where the food is for you, because I'm sure you're all hungry. Thank you.